Morning guys, how we doing today? This is 1959. We're looking at what a record store would have had for new jazz releases in 1959. What would have been on the shelves? And we've done 10-inch era, we talked 55, 56, 57, 58. We're seeing the changes happening more and more rapidly as we move forward. And 59 is an incredible year. It's a landmark year in some regards. Its biggest change of device was the success jazz was going to have now on Columbia Records. They've been dabbling since '56 with the Jazz Messengers, Don Byrd, G.G. Christ Jazz Lab. They signed Miles. They started putting his stuff out in '57. Monk's coming in '60, '61. So Columbia's starting to give a much bigger stage to modern jazz, edges of the avant-garde, modern composition. They aren't just putting out Armstrong, Ellington, Goodman stuff like they did for decades. They're starting to recognize the peripheral edges of the new music and thus giving modern jazz a much bigger stage to operate from. And Mingus Aoun, Brubeck Time Out, and of course Miles Davis's Kind of Blue are kind of legendary for 1959 as a sea change. But part of that dramatic change is the fact that music of that ilk is now being distributed nationwide. And that's probably the most significant factor. Because Mingus had already been making groundbreaking music since Pithecanthropus erectus, Miles has done stuff more on the edges than Kind of Blue. You know, Brubeck's been doing what he does forever. And of course, Ornette does make some giant steps in by Coltrane. 59 is a prolific year, but I think it gets a little overexposed in terms of those 3-4 records that people talk about over and over again. That's a small microcosm of an entire bigger landscape of jazz that I feel like so much of the modern day writer doesn't have any scope of. The modern day critic is very much been reduced to the most smallest of canon. I feel like to be a jazz critic writer today, you got to know 5% of the jazz canon. And that's the 5% that's available in print most of the time. Because that's who's paying you to market that stuff. That's who's paying you to write reviews on that shit. And that's not that stuff's not good. It's just from a perspective's sake, what's available today is a small percentage of the jazz landscape. There's thousands of white artists doing this music, making a living that will fall into complete obscurity, that are part of the landscape at the time. There's hundreds of black artists who haven't really made the transition to the broad fame of Coltrane or Miles Davis, or even an Ornette Coleman. So 59, we're going to do it by label. I think that's kind of an interesting way to look at it. We're going to start with Blue Note and Prestige. Prestige is doing some interesting things here in 59. New Jazz, of course, has been launched where they're putting their edgier titles. And I'm going to show for you the dramatic difference between a 7000 Prestige in this moment and a New Jazz 8200 record. We're going to start here with Gene Ammons, Boss Tenor. This is 7180. And Gene Ammons is the king of gut bucket blues jazz, soul jazz. He swings hard. He's not composition driven. He's not trying to speak about his ability as much as he is expressing his experience through his horn and being very much connected back to the Coleman Hawkins, the Lester Youngs, the great storytellers, Ben Webster's in this music, you know, and for me, that's the dividing line. And we're starting to see in jazz a great rift developing between the old blues-driven music that was comfortable, familiar, and thus allowed me to emote cleanly and plainly without having to think about complex changes, and the new dawning of much more complex compositions and arrangements, which are there to make you think about the music and less about the underlying social constructs and designs of society that the blues can't help but make you think of. Again, we talk about modern art. A lot of modern art is so soulless that when you look at a Pollock or something, you don't really get a human narrative. It's just abstract color. And so it's approved by all camps because it's not going to give you empathy for those poor minorities over there who are trying to garner sympathy. Composition tends to lean that way at times. It doesn't mean I don't love a lot of composed, written stuff. Ellington was one of the greatest composers ever, and I love almost all his stuff, but the blues never ever escaped Ellington. Soul, improvisation was always a part of his bands. And of course, improvisation stays a part of modern composed jazz in the 60s, which we're seeing coming about. It just feels definitely fueled by a different engine. It's driven by a different source. This is a throwback. This guy is the gut bucket. You know what I mean? He really has that soulful, just, it's all about feeling. I'm driving down a road I know well. That's what the blues is. It's a road I'm familiar with. I don't got to think about my directions. I'm not looking for that turn past the third post office box. I just know these chord changes are effortless to me. And so therefore, I'm free to let my soul wander when I play. And I can express deep, long narratives because I don't got to think about composition. Composition, on the other hand, requires more of a mental exercise. Going, I've rehearsed this a lot, but okay, where's that time change? Where's that key left-hand turn? I'm in a free mode here. When is that drummer going to change? Oh, shoot. It's a mental exercise, and that actually inhibits the ability to freely emote. And people kind of debate this with me a little bit, but I got thousands of records, and I've been focused on feeling, trying to hear what a guy's telling me. And I think it's plain as day. The guys who are more compositionally heavy emote from a different place. It's just how art operates. So again, 7,180, 7,174, Brother Jack McDuff. Not his first, but he's already been on the scene a little bit for Prestige. But this is with Bill Jennings, the great guitar player, 7174. And again, organ, soul jazz, it's Chicken Shack, it's Gut Bucket. You got some dirty hands when you're listening to Jack McDuff. It goes right with the Gene Ammons. Shirley Scott has really ascended. She has made a long streak of records at Prestige, and she will well into the next decade. She does a long streak of records at Impulse as well. She works with Stanley Turrentine a lot. She works with Lockjaw Davis a lot. Shirley Davis is one of the baddest chicks in the history of this music. But again, she fits in with the Lockjaw, the Gene Ammons, the very sexy Coleman Hawkins, Buddy Tate, Arnett Cobb, Eddie Lockjaw Davis. This is that same ilk of swing era guys who know how to play the blues effortlessly. And so when they get together, it's just about having fun, kicking the bucket and saying, oh, this is what I did last night. Girl was good. That sugar was sweet. That candy was sticky. Let me tell you about it. It's the basic, simplest essence of blues. Arnett Cobb, once again, 7165. Tenor, the Texas tenor sound in the Illinois Jacquette School. He is a wonderful storyteller, a big, full, earthy, broad tone. His reed seems to stick in your mouth. You can taste the saliva. It's such a gutsy storytelling on your knee. You can almost taste what I did last night. And if your mom wasn't here, I'd probably give you a little some taste. See what I'm saying? I'd probably tell you a little bit more about what happened. And then in that same vein is Willis Jackson, number 7162. So you can see 1969, 7,000 series, 7174, 7180, 7165. It really runs about 7160 to 7200 is where their 59 stuff is in the 7,000 series. And Willis Jackson is in that same vein. It's just gutsy, full of soul. Bill Jennings is also on this, as is Jack McDuff. Tommy Potter's on the bass. I love these records, and I love them in their context. If you are DJing a set, people are dealing with their hangovers, they got a plate of breakfast food in front of them, you put on some soul jazz, they're going to be like, okay, that's a bit of a balm for my aching head right now. You put on some screeching avant-garde or even some modern composed second quintet Miles, it's going to have so much edge to it and angle to it that it doesn't sit as comfortably with someone who's not as engaged as a listener. Those more composed pieces, they require more of a dedicated engagement, where you're sitting down and trying to absorb composition, trying to absorb key changes and melodies and different dynamics. The dynamics of the blues is ready, now let's feel this shit. It's a very different feel, and almost all jazz records will fall into one of those two camps by this time. And sadly, in some ways, the blues that fueled this music for decades starts to really get pushed aside. And the composed nature of modern jazz starts to really come to the fore. For better or for worse, but it does drive the dancing and the audiences away even more so. And on top of that, you have Elvis happening, Sinatra's happening, all the pop stars of the 50s it's a tough marketplace for jazz as it is. And it started to disseminate itself and feed on itself by splitting its audience so dramatically. Even here in '59, we're starting to see that happen. Now, Prestige launches the 8200 series in new jazz, and look how different the content is here. Mal Waldron, Impressions. Mal's one of the great New York pianists. If you haven't seen my Jazz Journal episode on the New York piano players, in discovering where all the great New York musicians were in jazz, I realized that most of the great New York players were piano players. I list 15 of them in that episode I did. 15 great jazz piano players of this era that are New Yorkers. And there's other, Rollins, there's other players from New York, of course, but it's amazing how piano-driven the New York jazz musician is. And I had some other reasons for it. One of them, I think, is the piano lends itself to a lot of work. You can be a solo engaged artist playing in some piece of shack on a piano and get work. And when you're in New York, you got to pay bills. It's interesting stuff how that kind of plays out. But Powell, Monk, it's a long list. Elmo Hope, you should check it out if you haven't seen it. Waldron does some pretty impressive modern stuff here. It's just a trio. I think Addison Farmer is on the bass, and Al Heath is on the drums. Addison Farmer is, of course, Art Farmer's brother. Yusef Lateef, again, is making records here at this point in '59. Cry Tender. He's now left Savoy, and he's firmly entrenched now at Prestige New Jazz for the next couple years before he goes to Impulse. And he's also making this incredibly edged out, dynamic world music. Yusef has a lot of interesting horns and percussion instruments from around the world. Some great players on this. Herman Wright, Frank Gant, Wilbur Hart, and Ernie Farrell. The great Oliver Jackson on drums. It's a pretty serious session, and it's a great deal more modern and out there than what we see in the 7000 series. Oliver Nelson. This is before he becomes the great arranger that we know of from Impulse and Verve in the 60s. He's still a player at this point. At 8224 with Kenny Dorham and Ray Bryant. This is a serious record. He already has a lot of edges and elements of modernism and avant-gardism coming into his playing. He's playing with Dorham, Bryant, Wendell Marshall, and Art Taylor. These will both feel very different than from what I showed you in the 7000 series. And last in this series, 8200, is 8225. Kenny Dorham, Quiet Kenny. And this is a great record. If I recall, it's a trio. It's a quartet with Flanagan, Chambers, Taylor, and Dorham. It's wonderful, melancholy. Dorham is one of those mid-range trumpet players in the same range as the Donald Byrds. He's not as intense as the Lee Morgans and Freddie Hubbards, and he's not as laid back as the Chet Bigers and the Art Farmers and Miles Davis. He's got a lot of oomph and guts and blues and drive. He's got certain elements of composition. He's definitely a more edgy player than anything you see on the 7000 series. So it's pretty clear at this point how different Nu Jazz is from Prestige, even though they're on the same label for all intents and purposes. Now, Blue Note across town is doing some impressive stuff as well. I don't think they're quite as prolific here or as agitated as they were in 57, 56, 58. There's a stretch there from 56 to 58 where Blue Note stuff is very militant and agitated and fiery and focused. And Sonny Clark was in the roster at that point. Curtis Fuller has now departed. He's moved on to United Artists and Savoy. So as the rosters change for Blue Note, there's kind of a shift. And some of the new guys they bring in are more modern, compositional, edges of the avant-garde. And so hard bop's already starting to decline, even at Blue Note by 59. You have guys like Jackie McLean, who was at Prestige from 56, 57. He comes over to Blue Note here in 1959, number 4013 in the New Soil. And this is a seriously awesome record. Very intense. He's playing with Walter Davis Jr., whose record I'm going to show you here in a second. Pete LaRocca, Paul Chambers, Donald Byrd is also on this. Donald Byrd is like a consistent sound of Blue Note through all these eras. He never varies too far into the wilderness, and he always keeps kind of a centered tact for the sessions that he's on. We might as well jump into this Walter Davis record next. This is number 4018. So as you can see, most of these Blue Notes here are going to be early in the 4000 sequence. That's going to put us in 1959. 4008 through about 4030, and it's a lot fewer records now in the year than what they did in 58, 57, and of course a lot of these labels are no longer issuing a ton of back catalog, although Prestige actually is. Prestige is still putting out tons of old vault stuff. So does Savoy. Savoy never seems to stop putting out. But again, Savoy's main body of work comes from the late 40s, early 50s. So of course they're going to keep trying to get that stuff out there for people to consume in the new format of the 12-inch LP. He's a great piano player, really driving. He's got a long, hard groove to him, somewhat in the Horace Silver sense. Byrd is fantastic on this. In fact, there's a song here that's going to be my next Throat Grabbers. I was listening to it last night, and I heard some fire come out of Byrd's horn that I had to double take. I'm like, that's Donald Byrd? Wow. More intense than he normally would even be. Byrd himself starts in 58, and here in 59, he starts the Blue Note in 58. Here in 59, Off to the Races was 58. Fuego, Bird in Hand. He has about 3 records in 59 that are all outstanding. I picked this one with Charlie Rouse, Pepper Adams, Walter Davis, Sam Jones, and Art Taylor. And Walter Davis, for a brief moment here, kind of becomes the new Sonny Clark. Clark has departed for other labels at this point. Clark has a bad drug habit. So Walter Davis is now sitting in on a lot of these records, and he has a different motivation than Clark. These records don't come across nearly as intense or socially charged. And it's not to say the guys still aren't thinking about that stuff, because you can't be a black male in America and not be conscious of the risk that you are undertaking every day walking the streets. It's an ever-present experience. Hank Mobley returns to the Jazz Messengers in 59. And an interesting side note is the only real session as an album that Mobley makes with the Jazz Messengers is that Columbia first record. And he does the Cafe Bohemia stuff in 54 live with them. And then in 59 he comes back and does these two At the Jazz Corner of the World records. And Timmons is on this, Jamie Merritt, Lee Morgan, and Hank Mobley. And Mobley and Morgan together have worked off and on for a number of years at this point, and there's a dexterity and a fire, just a brilliant interplay between the two of them, and Merritt and Blakey and Timmons are starting to lock down what becomes one of the greatest rhythm sections in jazz. You know, the Basie rhythm section, of course, is one of the most incredible, with Walter Page and Count Basie and Joe Jones and Freddie Green. But that's more of a hard swinging, space-driven rhythm section. This was more of an up-tempo, chop your head off rhythm section. These guys were madmen. These are great records. If nothing else, it's Mobley's return to the group. And he moves along quickly after this, again, onto his own things. And Mobley's career is quite interesting, actually. He's working with Dizzy in 54. In 55, he's working with Blakey and the Messengers. In 56, he goes on with Horace Silver. In 57, 58, he's doing his own stuff. Plus, he's working with... Oh, crap, I was just thinking about who was it. He's doing a lot of work with someone else in 58. I can't think of it right now. I'll put it in... I'll write it in later when I edit this. And then in 59, he comes back to the Messengers. And then by 61, he's working with Miles. So he's really a predominant figure in a lot of ways, Mobley, that really didn't get much credit at the time. And I discovered recently that he ended up being homeless and broke for years. Hank Mobley, a guy whose records fetch thousands of dollars nowadays, didn't really get much recognition in his lifetime. One of my favorite records ever, and I recommend this to any beginner, any novice, anyone who's not sure how much they like jazz, they don't know the colors they want to participate with. Tender Feelings is a great record to start with. It's beautiful, it's melancholy. Duke Pearson becomes a very important person at Blue Note. Ike Quebec has passed. He was the A&R talent scout. He helped arrange sessions. Ike was a great reader of charts and could read really well. Pearson comes along and kind of fills that role of Blue Note. And he also makes a series of great records. Profile from 59 is also outstanding. But Tender Feelings for me is one of my favorite records ever, honestly. On Green Dolphin Street's fantastic. Bluebird of Happiness is fantastic. 3 a.m. is fantastic. When Sunny Gets Blue is fantastic. It's with Gene Taylor, who plays with Horace Silver quite a lot, and Lex Humphreys on the drums. Just a trio, but it's beautiful. It's something I play at my gigs a lot. You know, you're kind of just shaking the smoke out of your eyes from your night of drinking last night, and I play some Duke Pearson 3 a.m., they'll be like, okay, I need more of that in my life. What is that? Benny Green, 4010. I've talked about him numerous times lately. He's a much more swing-based storytelling trombone player versus the J.J. Johnsons, Jimmy Clevelands, and Curtis Fullers. He's not doing bebop and hard bop. He's playing a hard swinging blues, and he's a groove storyteller. This is the great Walking and Talking. All his records in the late 1500 series and early 4000 series are fantastic, and in a different way than Curtis Fuller, who also was a Blue Note at this time, although Fuller's actually departed by 59. The Three Sounds, this is their second record. The first one was number 1600 at the very end of the 1500 series. This is number 4014. Bill Dowdy, Andrew Simpkins, and Gene Harris. Gene Harris is one of the great pocket players in the history of this music. He plays a lot of space, a lot of blues. These records are so amazing. They're very accessible, and that should not be held against them. Being accessible is a good thing, not a bad thing. He never ever goes too far from the blues. He's always speaking with a passionate fire and fury. These records are just fun. And I think people don't recognize how great they are, in part because they're available, because they sold well. But Jimmy Smith and the Three Sounds helped keep Blue Note tangible for a long time. And then, of course, Horace Silver blowing the blues away. This is outstanding with Junior Cook, Blue Mitchell, Eugene Taylor, Louis Hayes. That was the working group for quite a while for Horace Silver. And Horace Silver is as integral to the hard bop sound as Blakey from a more mid-tempo climate. Blowing the Blues Away, St. Vitus Dance, Peace, the Baghdad Blues. It's just great stuff. And people should never pass up the chance to get a Horace Silver record when that opportunity arises. I'm wearing my Dexter Gordon shirt. Dexter, of course, is in jail from 56 to 59, and he's about to get out, make his comeback record on Riverside on the Jazzland label, The Resurgence of Dexter Gordon, which isn't a landmark recording of his, but then in 61 he's going to go to Blue Note, and Dexter Gordon's going to reignite the fire of blues at Blue Note in 61. So that's part one of this. Stay tuned for part two coming tomorrow. We're going to talk about Riverside and Verve and a few other great labels. And then part three, we're going to talk about some of the giants in the West Coast and the giants on the major labels. Peace.